am I saying? 11-12, sorry, 11-12. You see very significant decline in absolute numbers of the poor by the Tendulkar methods, and over 50 million decrease in the absolute numbers of the poor. Now, of course, we have still 350 million poor people by the higher poverty line. Now, 65 years down the road after independence, if you say we still have a quarter of our country's population which is poor and 350 million people who are poor, then it really just breaks your heart. What more can you say? But let me just re-emphasize that there was a sharp improvement in the rate at which poverty was declining, the incidence of poverty declining between 2004-05 and 2011-10, from a previous decline rate of 0.5% per annum to a decline rate of nearly 2% per annum. So that's a very sharp change. Something has really changed here. Let me turn to my final sort of point about so-called success story, if I may. And this is really essentially based on the India Human Development Report of 2011, which we wrote for the Planning Commission. It's only the second India National Human Development Report. And we came to the following conclusion. We were asked to focus our attention on how the SCs, the STs, and the minorities, particularly the Muslims, are doing. And we came to the following conclusion. Caitlin mentioned the increase in the HDI. I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to talk about, just in a few sentences, of how we've claimed that during this period of fast economic growth, we've seen social inclusion taking place. Because we establish empirically for the SCs, for the STs, and for the Muslims, the three most marginalized groups in our society, that by and large, for most social indicators, their social indicators have been improving faster than the national average. So we claim on the basis of that social inclusion has been taking place now. Sociologists may well claim that improving social indicators faster than the national average is not the only measure of social inclusion. There are other measures. Of course, we don't deny that. But you cannot say that if social indicators were worsening, or the gap between the national average and the SCs, STs, and Muslims were worsening, then social inclusion. No, obviously you could not have claimed that. So we are claiming that social inclusion has happened. Much more remains to be done. No question about that. The Muslims are doing better than the SCs and STs. But the SCs and STs and the Muslims, their social indicators are still worse than the national average. But convergence is taking place. That's the point. And in fact, we established, and Amir, you'll be interested in this, that our conclusions, which are based on 2000s data as opposed to the 1990s data, which Sachar Committee report was based on, we established quite clearly and empirically that there is convergence taking place between Muslim indicators and national. And in other words, things are not as bad as they were, as Sachar Committee had demonstrated, and I think rightly demonstrated. It's just that we are using the 2000s data and not using the 1900s data. None of this takes away from the point that Saidaji was making about girls' education. We also make that point. Anyway, now let me turn to the very serious challenges that remain. And let me start with the health sector. I think in the previous session, a very, very important point was made here by the doctor here about the shortage of doctors in the public health system. And some suggestions were made by Saidaji about RMPs. They want to come on board. But their wanting to come on board alone doesn't help. The fact of the matter is that unless we ensure that these RMPs get training, there's no point in bringing them on board. Because how will you monitor them? How will you manage them? How will you monitor them is a big, big question. So the question then arises, is the public health expenditure rising fast enough to set up training institutes in the country, across the country, in large enough numbers to train nurses and these RMPs to bring them on board. It's not just, saying, oh, we need our MPs coming on board. They need training. Otherwise, there's no point in bringing them on board. Let's be very clear about that. Secondly, there is a very serious shortage of doctors in the rural areas, not in the urban areas. We all know that. So how are we going to get the doctors in the rural areas actually sitting in PHCs or sub-centers that Sonal was so rightly emphasizing, which are 24/7. If they're not 24/7, no one's going to go there. So don't be surprised if they don't go there. They have to be functional 24/7, and in Tamil Nadu they go there. Because most of the PHCs are 24/7. And for that you need to put money, and you need warm bodies. You need trained nurses, doctors to be there, and you need to build houses for them. Where they have housing in the PHC, they will live there. So they will not have to travel from anywhere. That's not now. So how are you going to ensure this? The way you're going to ensure it, and Sri Lanka did this 50 years ago, for God's sake. What I'm about to say, that you require all MBBS doctors, the moment they come out, that they will spend a year in rural areas. Now but who's against this? The MCI is against this. The MCI has fought this tooth and nail. Sri Lanka did this 50 years ago, ladies and gentlemen. Why can't we do this? There are some very serious vested interests here in play. So, exhorting ourselves to, let's do this and let's do that. Let's first break the vested interests back. If you don't do that, forget about it. Point number 3. We need 3-year degree trained doctors, not 5-year degree trained doctors. 5-year degree trained doctors will be in urban areas. Forget about expecting them to be in rural areas. You have that in Chhattisgarh. Why can't we follow that? In Tamil Nadu, they're still using 5-year trained doctors, but they make sure that, in the medical colleges, which are in the rural areas, and of course the number of medical colleges is much higher per 1,000 population, they bring on board students from rural areas. So they prefer to be in rural areas. So there are models in place which are functional, and all we need to do is to replicate them. So what that requires is warm bodies, and for warm bodies you need money. 1.2% of GDP allocation is not going to do it. Okay, let me turn to this issue of the RSBY. Now, the RSBY came about in 2008. I had joined the Planning Commission in 2006. One of the first few things I was asked to do by the Deputy Chairman was to do a paper for us, for the Planning Commission, on health insurance system. So I did, but when I wrote that paper, what I had in mind was that the objective of the RSBY, and the objective that I had written down in that document, was that we will have an RSBY-like thing in order to cut down on private out-of-pocket costs. Because we all know that private out-of-pocket costs are the serious problem, which is what Sonal's been talking about. I didn't think that this is going to be at the expense of greater expenditure on public health system. It is not this or that, it's this and that. So lo and behold, in the 15th of August speech from the ramparts of the Red Fort, the Prime Minister announces an RSBY, and a year later it gets rolled out. And anyone who's seen the evaluations of the RSBY can only shed tears, frankly, can only shed tears. Every evaluation that you read about in the EPW tells a very sorry tale. My brother, who's a doctor in Lucknow, keeps telling me how the system is being ripped off all the time by a collusion between the doctors and the patient. 30,000 rupees is supposed to be allocated. It's being ripped off. Whether you're sick or not, people split that 30,000 rupees over the course of the year between the doctor, the provider, and the provided. So very serious problem with the RSBI. And if there is going to be a trade-off between increased expenditure on the public health system on the one hand and increased coverage of the RSBI on the other, then there are real serious issues. Let me turn to a very important issue, again remaining in the health sector, that my good friend Amir raised about unwanted pregnancies. Half of them are unwanted. Why are they unwanted? Why are you getting unwanted pregnancies? Because there's unmet need. Amir will understand what I'm talking about. Meaning that people want modern means of contraception, there's no one to provide it. And you will meet the unmet need only if you have functional primary health centers. That's the only way it has been done ever anywhere in the world. Functional health centers. 24/7 primary health centers, which require training of nurses on a vast scale, because the ratio in our country, if nobody showed this number, but if you look at India India in the league table of the ratio between nurses or paramedic staff to doctors, we're among the worst. We're among the worst. Because over the period of the neglect of the primary health system in UP, for instance, most of the damned nurse training centers closed down. A few years ago, early part of the 11th plan, there were hardly any nurse training centers in existence. How is that ratio going to change? How are you going to make sure PHCs have, the sub-centers have ANMs, the auxiliary nurse midwives, 24/7, who are resident there? If you don't have them, you don't have them. You have to put the money there and the institutions to train them to actually ensure that that happens. And by the way, on the TFR, there's good news but there's bad news as well. In the Planning Commission's HDR of 2002 said there were 4 states at that time which had achieved TFR of 2.1, the replacement rate. In our HDR, 2011, but it was citing only 2009 data, that's the best data we had at that point, there were 9 states which had achieved replacement rate TFR. The 4 big defaulters, culprits in the TFR, are the ones you expect. UP, Bihar, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh. 3.6, 3.5 TFR. That's where most of the unmet need is. If you don't concentrate on ensuring unmet need there in the rural areas, it ain't happening. It ain't happening. Because for the country as a whole, by the way, it's predicted that in 2015 we will have achieved 2.1 in the country as a whole. Because in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, etc., Punjab, it's dropping so low, the TFR, that it will compensate for the UP, Bihar, Rajasthan, etc. But that's not the point. Because poverty is getting concentrated in these erstwhile 4 or 5 states, now including Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand. So if you get 30 people getting killed, well, these are the underlying structural factors. Let's take care of these underlying structural factors. I'll just make an aside here before I come back to the 12th plan. Aside here, because Saidaji raised the point about Maoist violence. 4 years ago, when I was head of the Rural Development Division, we created an expert group for the first time in 20 years on the development challenges in extremist affected areas. It's a report which is downloadable from the website of the Planning Commission. I'd recommend to all of you to read it. Background papers for that report have been edited by me and are forthcoming in a book by Sage later this year. Essentially, we argue that if you don't address the development challenges and the social injustices that the peoples of these states have suffered, there is not any chance of the violence dropping. But you will address the development challenges only if you have peace. And you can have peace only if you have talks. If you don't have talks, you can't have peace. And we are willing to listen, to talk to the JKLF in J&K. We are willing to talk to the Nagas. We've been talking to them for 20 years. But somehow we haven't succeeded in opening up talks with this. Because unfortunately, what are good are the Nakshal friends who managed to kill the leader of the Salwa Judum, which should never have come into existence in the first place. That was our committee's report, the Salwa Judum. Never have even been created. I mean, what our Nakshals don't realize and recognize is that when they do carry out actions like this in order to draw attention, we haven't gone away, so don't take us lightly. What they don't realize is that it's going to cause a reaction. It only entrenches the belief of many people that this is an internal security issue. This is the most serious security issue in the country. Is it? I'm not so sure. Read our forthcoming book, or at least read that report. Let me turn to the next issue, which nutrition. Very rightly pointed out that both rich and poor are undernourished. And I think two of you perhaps rightly noted that actually the problem is elsewhere. It's not, if you attack nutrition per se, the problem is not going to get solved. And one of the problems, I have time only to look at only one of the problems, is sanitation, which some of you touched on. Now, Amir asked the question, toilets are being built, why are they not being used? My friend, first let's talk about the toilets being built. We have data on this in the India Human Development Report, and very interestingly, you now even have data in the Census 2011. Census 2011 says that only 32% of the total households in our country have toilets. 32%. 65 years after independence. And the data that was shown here earlier was right. 70 to 80% of rural households don't have a toilet. Now, and those toilets which have been built using a subsidy from the government targeting the BPL. I'm going to come back to that targeting the BPL, because I don't agree with Sonal at all, because things have moved on from the time that the situation that she's describing. But those toilets are not being used. Why are they not being used, Amir asked. The reason why they are not being used is because you need mindset change before you're going to use those toilets. Those toilets, when built with a subsidy, mean another room for the rural household. A chidiya khana, a place to keep, husk and fodder and, murgi khana and stuff like that. Why should it be used as a toilet? For centuries, me and my, predecessors, my forefathers have used the fields, and you're telling me I should use the toilet. Why? Mindset change. When people realize that when all of you shit together in a village, you are creating about 500 kilos of shit at the end of the month, every month. And that the flies which come back and sit on your glass of food or your glass of water you drink or your food, you're eating and drinking shit. All that needs to happen. All that needs to happen is that mindset change. How do you trigger that mindset change? There are methods. But the Nirmal Bharat Abhiyan, which is the new version of the total sanitation campaign, doesn't even begin to recognize that. Therefore, we are working very hard to ensure that those guidelines change. That what matters is not giving a subsidy to build a toilet, because once people realize that I'm eating and drinking everybody else's shit, they will build the toilet themselves. You don't have to give them a subsidy to build it. And boy, Jove, I've seen it happen. Mindset changes like that. It's an explosion that occurs at the community level. When triggering is done at a proper level, it happens within half an hour. But you need thousands of foot soldiers to be the triggers. You need people to be trained to be triggers, thousands of them. Otherwise, it ain't happening. You may go on subsidizing the building of the toilets and they will still not be used. The classic case is that of the Punjabi family, which has the beautiful, angan and the beautiful bathroom with the tiles and the flush and the everything. And 5 o'clock in the morning, they sit in the Maruti and go to the canal to shit. All of them together. Okay. So, that's what has to change. If you don't change that, forget about reducing diarrheal disease for children. If you don't reduce diarrheal disease, absorption of food that is ingested does not happen, and malnutrition will continue. It's true for women, and it's true for men. Why do I say women in particular? Can you even begin to imagine, any of you? What is the meaning? What is the meaning of withholding water or withholding eating that women have to do on a daily basis? Because during the day they cannot go. They cannot go. Can you imagine 50% of our rural population lives under those circumstances? Do any of us even begin to recognize and understand what that means and what implications that has for the health of those women? So if these women are perennially sick, and they are small and stunted, and they give birth to small babies, and we have the highest low birth weights low birth weight children in the world, why are we surprised?